Welcome. I'm Spencer Overton. I'm a professor and the founder and faculty director of the Multiracial Democracy Project here at GW Law School. We focus on solutions that facilitate our nation's transition to a well-functioning multiracial democracy that truly represents our increasingly diverse population. We serve as a bridge between academics, civil rights, democracy reform, technology, philanthropic, and policy communities. Right now, we've got two initiatives, one focusing on AI and the other on alternative election structures. Really appreciate you joining us today. Over the past few months, we've had a great turnout and fascinating discussion. You can check out our past webinars on our Multiracial Democracy Project YouTube channel. The goal here of this series is to create a space for thought leaders from philanthropy, the academy, and media to come together and consider how contemporary issues should shape how we build a multiracial democracy. Now, before I introduce our guest for today, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping items. Our next webinar will be on Friday, May 16th. We'll be joined by Professor Taeku Lee, who's the Bay Family Professor of Government at Harvard University. Professor Lee will discuss voting behaviors in the AAPI community during the 2024 election. We'll also be joined on this topic by Terry O. Minnis. She's the VP of Census and Voting Programs for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. The following month, on Friday, June 20th, we're excited to welcome Jacqueline Delian, a senior staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund, NARF, and Megan Gall, a principal at Blackwell Consulting, to speak about Indigenous community voting trends in the 2024 election. Just as a reminder about the format today, we're going to record the entire session. And I assume that we're recording right now, including any interactive conversation. We don't want a chill discussion of sensitive items. So if you'd like to ask a question but remain anonymous, just send your question or comment directly to me in the comments box. And indicate that you'd like to remain anonymous in that comment, and I'll read your question or comment to the group without mentioning your name. So just before I introduce our speakers for today, I want to explain their significant connection to our work. The Multiracial Democracy Project, I talked about our Alternative Election Systems Project. So we're working with 15 national Asian American, Black, Latino, and tribal voting rights groups, as well as the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute at Harvard Law School, to examine the racial implications of election reforms like proportional representation for communities of color. Our concern is that if the U.S. Supreme Court continues to scale back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, like it scaled back affirmative action, politicians will be able to freely gerrymander districts to dilute the power of voters of color, and then defend themselves in court by saying that they redrew the districts for political rather than racial reasons. Also, if the court further scales back Section 2, affirmative action opponents like Ed Blum might bring lawsuits attempting to dismantle many majority Black, Latino, Asian American, and tribal districts, claiming that they are excessively race-based. The late Lani Guinier predicted this problem. She proposed proportional representation as an alternative that would make gerrymandering less relevant and allow for fairer representation and power sharing for people of color and all people in the country. Our goal is to work with our 15 voting rights groups over the next 3 years to really understand the costs and benefits for communities of color of various forms of proportional representation, so that we're prepared with a game plan if the court scales back the Voting Rights Act. We also want to help them build capacity so they can be thought leaders in democracy reform debates, which are currently not very diverse. So far, we've raised $5.5 million for the project, but we still need to raise another $1.5 million. So please reach out to me if you know of folks who might be interested in helping us close our gap. One of our key partners in this work is More Equitable Democracy, which is a racial justice organization that gives grants to local racial justice organizations to explore electoral reforms on the state and local level. We're grateful to be joined by George Cheung, the founding director of More Equitable Democracy and the organizer of our learning tour to Germany to observe their recent elections and to learn more about Germany's system of proportional representation and its connection to Germany's unique culture and history. Prior to More Equitable Democracy, George served as program director for the Joyce Foundation's Democracy Program and co-chair of the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. There's much more, but the most important thing is that, he's a visionary and he's a true servant leader. Along with George, we're excited to welcome Neal Ubriani, who's the Policy and Research Director at the Institute for Responsive Government. In this role, Neal helps states and local jurisdictions research, develop, and implement policy solutions to make government more efficient, accessible, and responsive. I got to know Neal on More Equitable Democracy's learning tour in Germany, and we served together on More Equitable Democracy's advisory board. So I'm thankful to Neal and that he's offered to share his experiences from the trip with us today as well. So to help set the stage for our discussion, we'll show a 7-minute video about our trip to Germany. Following that, we'll have a chance to hear from George and Neal themselves about their experiences. This trip was an incredible learning experience for me, and I'm really excited for us to be able to share it with you. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
If there's one thing Germans know, if there's one thing that Germans can teach other people, is that democracy and the rule of law can never be taken for granted. It's breakable.
It is very difficult to travel through Germany and take a historical tour of this place and not see consistent echoes of what's happening in the United States.
This part of Berlin has been described as a memorial landscape.
The kinds of radical political innovation, the kinds of instability.
Sophie was caught by the warden of Munich University distributing leaflets, and he seized her and handed her over to the Gestapo.
A lot of that we saw here is really reminiscent of what's going on in the United States while we're here.
Good morning. My name is George Cheung. I direct More Equitable Democracy. Welcome to Germany.
We are here today in Berlin, Germany. We came to this country to watch their elections because we think that there's a lot to learn about how Germany conducts their elections that we could take back with us in the United States.
I chose to come on this trip because I think understanding the world around us, understanding the communities that exist and how those communities both came to be and where they're going can help all of us really develop our next steps, understand history, and ensure that it doesn't repeat itself.
The trip is a great mix of election policy.
It is not an MMP problem. It is not a mixed member system problem.
Contemporary politics, but also history, and all three of those fit together because the election structure is grounded in Germany's history.
A lot of what we learned about what led up to the atrocities of the Holocaust started off with law. It started off with a democratic process.
So the reason why we are stopping here and going to see this memorial, of course, has to do with what happened here in 1933. They didn't call it book burning, of course, no? We call it book burning. They called it action against the un-German spirit. It makes completely clear that there was one group that was going to define what was German and what was not.
We have an opportunity really to learn from German history and think, how do we want to address some of the challenges we're seeing in the US today?
Biggest items that has stood out for me is just how active of a democracy it is here. It's almost like we're spectators and we're watching a show in the United States, whereas here it feels like people are immersed in it. It is a daily activity to reflect on democracy and hopefully strengthen it.
They were not all Nazis, but they were a nation of passive spectators, basically. And today in Germany, they have developed this concept they call civil courage. This is, kids in school are taught, never be a spectator, never be a bystander.
I think the remembrance culture here is very contradictory to the US. The amount of accountability really shows, and that is something to pay attention to.
I'm a law professor at GW, and often I'll teach these systems. And so I'll read and get up to speed, but there's nothing like being immersed in a culture and in a system and absorbing it for a week or so. There are so many insights that I got out of this trip that are deeper than simply teaching it in a class.
You couldn't have gotten this from a book. Being able to talk to people who are politicians, advocates in the field, hearing from someone who was a part of forming the party that eventually helped overthrow a dictatorship. I mean, that's not something you're going to get out of a book.
Like, this trip is a learning tour, but it's also kind of an incubator for having these conversations about where to go next.
This trip was a chance to see a well-established multi-party democracy, understand why they created the system they have, what's the problem still with it, because no system does away with all problems. But the Germans have built this thing on the ashes of the world's worst system ever, and they were pretty careful about what they did.
Germany is really interesting because they essentially established a different system of proportional representation. It's called mixed member proportional. You get 2 votes.
1, who's your favorite candidate? 2, who's your favorite party? It's pretty simple and it's pretty straightforward.
I like the system. You know, we get 2 different votes. It's the Erststimme for a candidate, it's the Zweitstimme for a party. And I like the Zweitstimme more.
That's what I like about the German election system, that you have that broad variety of parties.
I never had doubts about proportional representation. I'm a believer. I wanted to see it in practice. The German system helps keep all of these parties in proportion, rather than giving undue influence to a faction like the far right, which is growing, but overall is still a small portion of society.
You know, Germany had 83% turnout in this election, which is crazy to think about. Just the level of participation they have here relative to us.
What the Germans suggest to me is if you have better rules, you will get better outcomes.
After the Nazis had won the elections, the process of ending the democracy went quickly.
70 years is what we heard, and I couldn't think to myself, well, does that mean we have roughly 6 years to make sure we can save American democracy? Big thanks to More Equitable Democracy, and I look forward to continuing to build this network of people who really believe that we can do better.
I am teaching on Monday morning, jet lagged as hell, and talk about proportional representation versus winner take all in the United States. I'm going to lay out the situation, but I'm also going to let them know that I have some pretty strong opinions about which system functions better because I've seen it in action.
Let's turn it right over to George. George?
Hello. Thanks, Spencer. Thanks, Lisa, for having me. I'm really excited to share this experience. But just a little bit of background information, focusing on transforming our electoral system. We do that by supporting grassroots, people of color based organizations, providing them the tools and resources to transform their local electoral systems. And it's very fitting at this moment because I'm just packing up, leaving Portland because we had a great series of events, including an event called Lift Every Voice that honors the legacy and the leadership of Lonnie Guinier, who really provides a North Star in terms of understanding that we can and ought to change our electoral systems. So in general, we as an organization are kind of semi-agnostic to the policy reforms. What we understand is that winner-take-all systems are not very reflective of an electorate. And so the question remains, what should replace it? There are lots of different versions of proportional representation, and our role is really to be a tour guide, a Sherpa, a supporter of our partners so that they can go on a journey to determine which electoral systems are most beneficial for their communities in their home, in their jurisdictions. And so as we were building out our programmatic work, which focuses on a cohort model where we have specific partnerships with state and local based grassroots groups, providing them resources and research. But the thing that we started to think about is, how do our partners become true experts on electoral systems? It's one thing to watch videos and read articles. It's another thing entirely to feel like you are an expert. And so as we toyed around with the best way to up everyone's knowledge base, we thought, what could be better than actually giving them a hands-on experience with an election using proportional representation? And so we kind of, I had a lot of blank stares from my staff when I started pitching this idea, but I thought, hey, why don't we take advantage of the upcoming local elections in Ireland and take people there? Fundraising was decent, so we decided to make that our inaugural trip. So that set us on this course to really integrate this these learning tours as very a concrete way of providing that hands-on experience for people to become their own experts. Just a kind of brief primer, there are generally 3 different types of proportional representational systems. The first one that you just saw in that video is called mixed member proportional, where once again you have 1 vote for candidate and 1 vote for political party. I don't need to go into the specifics about the calculations, but that is essentially one model. Germany uses it 30 years ago. New Zealand adopts it as well, and it's used in a number of municipalities. There is something else in Ireland that they established as the first country to adopt what's called single transferable vote. It is a combination of a larger district with multiple members, multiple winners, plus ranked choice voting. So there is calculations that one uses to determine the result there, but essentially if you are 20% in that system, you'll also largely win about 20% of seats. And the final system is a party list system where largely you vote for a political party as opposed to candidates. There's variations on the theme, but South Africa, for instance, uses that party list system. So why did we pick Germany? We thought about a couple of things that in the face of fascism and the rise of Nazism and the end of World War II, they actually had a very thoughtful process that reflected on the system that they used as the Weimar Republic post World War I set in place its first elections. It didn't go particularly well, given that there was a lot of fragmentation and allowed for authoritarians to seize power. And so they replaced it with this kind of hybrid system that they, in some ways, invented. So that intentionality of thinking about a system given their political and historical context was very interesting to think about and reflect for us as Americans. The second thing is their commitment to a remembrance culture, that they don't paper over their past. They really embrace it. Their memorials aren't just plaques and some statue, they really require you to experience and think deeply about Germany's past, which is in some ways a fairly stark contrast to us in the US. And just in general, the parallels with the US at this point, we are both large countries. We have experiences with authoritarianism and the rise of an anti-immigrant scapegoating. And so we really wanted to delve deep into how those issues would play out under a different electoral system. So we are just so honored and thrilled to provide this opportunity to our partners, to our allies, really to deepen our knowledge, because at this point, things are so dark here that we must all think deeply about long-term systems change. And I'll turn it back over to Spencer.
Sounds good. Well, I'm just going to pass the mic to Neal here. Neal, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Spencer. And thank you to both you and Lisa for inviting me to be part of the panel. And thank you to George and MED for inviting me to be part of the group that went to Germany. I think I came at this as somebody who's very focused on state level reform in the United States. At the Institute for Responsive Government, our focus is state level research and advocacy for solutions that make government more accessible and efficient. And that's both for voters and for policymakers. And so a lot of that is focused on what the voting process actually looks like for people on the ground. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about turnout. What voting policies cause turnout to go up? What voting policies cause turnout to go down? And for years, for the past decade of my career, we focused on things like automatic voter registration, vote by mail, same-day voter registration, early voting on one side, and things like voter ID and documentary proof of citizenship on the other side of things that make turnout go down. And so this work on, the convenience voting aspect of election reform is focused on reducing administrative burdens to casting a ballot. And these have made a huge difference. But I think ultimately you reach a limit where some people just don't see a need in voting because they live in uncompetitive districts or they don't like either of the candidates. No matter how convenient you make the voting process, you still have to give people a reason to vote. And one major thing that I took away from this trip was the turnout levels in Germany. You heard me talking in the video about sort of 83% turnout in these elections and just how people felt in Germany about the electoral process. Just the extent to which people felt like they could honestly express their preferences in a way that people don't feel oftentimes in the United States. It was not just this lesser of two evils discussion. It wasn't just, I have to vote for this person because I don't like the alternative. It was sort of like an opportunity to honestly say, well, I prefer this party from sort of a wider selection of parties that sort of stakes out various positions. And that's important because the way the parties stake out distinct positions is very different from the way parties exist here, where they kind of just define themselves in opposition to each other. We are the Democrats, we define ourselves in opposition to what the Republicans do and vice versa. The other thing that really stuck out for me is oftentimes people say, well, I live in an uncompetitive district. My district is, 90-10 Democrat or 90-10 Republican. Nobody can say that in Germany. Nobody lives in an uncompetitive district in this system. Every single marginal vote matters because it contributes to the proportional vote share that a party gains, which translates to seats in the legislature. And so this ultimately is how Germany gets to 83% turnout in a nationwide election. And just for comparison, the eligible voter turnout in the 2024 election in the US was 64%. And that's kind of the national average. If you look at some states, like in Hawaii and Arkansas, you're barely cracking 50% of eligible voter turnout. And so this is a circumstance where either a plurality or even a bare majority of eligible voters are staying home. The actual winner is non-voting. And if the US was at 83% turnout, we'd be looking at 45 million more people participating in our elections. And this is something that's, not just Germany, it's consistent across proportional representation systems. Eligible voter turnout it goes up by 10% or more in a proportional representation system compared to a winner-take-all system. And I think this ties back to what you heard in the video. One of our guides was saying, German voters are not just passive spectators. They sort of are active participants in their democracy. And this is tied to the political structure. Your political structure has to give people a reason to believe that their vote makes a difference beyond simply that civic active participation. Um, and so I think that was what I took from Germany. They're really intentionally creating a culture of active participation through their political structures. And that's informed by history. It's also informed by sort of current circumstances. And so as the people on this call, my organization, George, Spencer, Lisa, we think about ways to bring proportional representation structures to the US. um, it's useful to think about what are the models that make people most civically engaged. How can we get more people engaged in elections that seem lower profile compared to presidential elections? How can we build models of proportional representation for local governments, for state legislatures, or even for the federal government? And so you heard me in the video talking about this trip as an incubator. I think it's also really more of an accelerator for us and partners in the field to see proportional representation in action and think about the best ways to move this forward in the US.
Sounds good. Thank you both. So just as a reminder where we are, we're recording YouTube, but we've also got a few other folks on in terms of the audience. So what we'll do is I'll start off with about 3 questions here for Neal and for George. Then we'll open it up. And if others have questions, please raise your hands and I'll come to you. And if not, I'll continue to just engage George and Neal. So this first question is for both of you, George and Neal. What's the difference? And Neal, you kind of alluded to it at the end of your remarks. What's the difference about learning about proportional representation in the abstract versus actually being there, seeing an election, seeing it in action?
Wow. The difference for me was getting to talk to real Germans about their experiences, and it just quickly just demystified things. Talking to people on the street, and how everyone was able to very simply explain the system. They all understood it. They all felt confident about it. And so that made me feel like, okay, everyone is very much bought into the system. And then hearing from, people who have run for office, or immigrant activists who are competing in that system. It just made it feel much more tangible, that could be somewhat easily adopted here in the US.
I would echo everything George said. Just the level of nuance you can understand in person compared to sort of just reading about it in the abstract. The analogy that I kept coming back to was, my first experience as a poll worker. I've written bills on same-day registration, but I'd never actually same-day registered somebody as a poll worker, and that experience, I think, informed for me. This is how this should work in practice. These are sort of the nitty-gritty questions that you should be asking. And I think I felt like, before this trip, I was asking like first order questions about proportional representation. Now, having seen it in action, I think I'm asking like third and fourth level questions. But okay, what would this actually look like? What are sort of the really specific questions when the rubber meets the road that need to be resolved that aren't just sort of like big picture things?
If I can add something, one of the surprising things that happened on election night. So we are there at the Bavarian Green Party's election night. We are not supporting any political party, by the way. This is all C3 conversation. But what happened was, after a little while of following the news coverage, giving the current results of the elections, they cut away and they went to what I thought was a recorded debate with party leaders. All of a sudden, they just had this roundtable with a reporter. It's all in German, so I didn't really know what was going on. And I kept remarking, like, why did they cut away from the results? Because I want to know the results. And now they're showing like an old debate video. And then someone said, oh, no, this is live. What they're doing now is they're moving beyond the election. And now, generally, now that we know the results, the reporter is asking them, okay, so who's going to form a governing coalition, and having them start that conversation, that negotiation And so it was just so interesting to think about, okay, we are pretty much done in the US on election night. We know who the majority winner is in general. They are halfway done at election night. Then the next phase is how can the different parties form enough of a coalition to get to 50+1 of seats? And that is this whole other way of, horse trading, of negotiating, of figuring out, you want a climate change priority, we want something around economic development, and we have the ability to form a coalition. So that was just really exciting to kind of watch it in real time.
So let me do this. I want to ask, I've got a couple more questions to ask, but I think folks who are probably on really understand PR, but I think that there'll be some folks who join us on YouTube, and I kind of want to go over a few basics here. There's this conceptual piece, right? This conceptual piece between our current winner-take-all system, as George talked about, where if you're either the largest majority or the largest minority, I should say, or there's just the largest group, that you get 100% of the power and you don't necessarily have to share it with others, and districts can be drawn so that even though you only have 45 or 50% of the votes, districts can be drawn so that you get, 80% of the power or more of the power, because it allows you to win a majority of districts because of gerrymandering in terms of single member districts. From a conceptual point, what we're talking about here in terms of PR is if you get 30% of the votes, you get 30% of the seats in the legislature. You get 30% of the power here. That's just a basic concept that we're talking about. So, we're all familiar with one person, one vote, and that's very important. We usually envision it as districts being about the same size, and that's it. I think there's this deeper piece, though, where if politicians can draw districts to make some voters more important and to give some voters more voice, that kind of takes away from one person, one vote to a certain degree. So we're basically saying, hey, different groups should share power, and that your political power should be in proportion to your the size of the number of votes you get. That's kind of the conceptual piece. I want to dig into, and George did a quick overview of different systems, 3 different ways to get to that concept of proportional representation. He did a quick overview. Let's go a little deeper in terms of Germany. It was mentioned in the video, right? In terms of voting for a candidate and then voting for a party. So either George or Neal, just tell us how does that allow the legislature to get to proportionality by having those 2 different votes?
Yeah, I'll start. So as the journalist said, most people focus on the second vote for the political party. And let's imagine that there is a 100-person parliament. With the second vote, let's say you belong to a center-left party. If your center-left party wins 20% of that second vote for a political party, you will win exactly 20% of seats, or 20 seats in that legislative body. Then you look at how many of those seats your party wins in those single member districts. Let's say you only win 5. So you are assured 20 seats, but you only won 5 outright in terms of the single member districts. You are at a deficit of 15. So it's a very simple process from there, because all the parties have published party lists of candidates that they would seat in the legislative body in order, usually with the political the party leader at the very top. You remove the 5 that won, and then from there you just take the top 15 to kind of top off or compensate your party to make sure that it's all proportional. I will mention that there's one interesting threshold that they included. Back under the Weimar Republic, when they had essentially a party list system, as long as you got enough votes for 1 seat, you would take that 1 seat. And on one level, it's great that a lot of voices in their first elections were represented, but it led to dozens of parties getting elected because they'd never done this before, so they didn't have a tradition of political parties. And that fragmentation of the system under strain from the economic challenges post World War I, it just collapsed and allowed authoritarianism to seize power. And so the rest is history. And so, just really briefly, the Germans thought about this fragmentation and essentially set a 5% threshold that if your party, as long as your party gets over 5% in that party vote, you will win that proportional percentage of seats. If you don't get that 5%, you actually don't win any seats at all, ensuring that there would be only kind of like parties that have a quote unquote significant amount of support, and that threshold that they set is 5%. That's really important because in this last election, there were two parties that just missed the 5% threshold, which made it easier for two political parties, the center left, the center right CDU, Christian Democrats, and the center left Social Democrats to form a two-party coalition, which in their history is a much more stable government than a three-party coalition. So in this past election, that 5% threshold was actually incredibly important.
And let me just also mention this in terms of Georgia. So you laid it out in terms of authoritarianism, right? So basically, after World War I, you got all these little parties because you don't have the 5% threshold. And the National Socialists, which are the Nazis, basically with only about 33, there were two different elections, but 33 to 37% of the vote were able to basically come in and take over power because you have all these small parties that have, 2% or whatever. By having a threshold of at least 5%, it really results in you having, 5, 6 significant parties that can coalesce and hopefully push back against authoritarianism here, right? So that's a big part of it. So George said, hey, after World War II, they had the 5% threshold. And I think after World War II, George, did they also introduce the districts along with the kind of party vote proportional representation?
Yeah, that happened all the same time, and I think 1949, I believe.
Right. Okay, good. Just wanted to go a little deeper into this here. So Neal, I know you're focused a bit on state legislatures as opposed to Congress here with regard to PR. What makes a state legislature a particularly good fit for an opportunity to explore proportional representation?
Yeah, it's a good question. We, like Germany, are a federal republic or a federalist government. And so as Justice Brandeis said, states are kind of laboratories of democracy. And state legislatures are really a fantastic opportunity to test out this idea of proportional representation in a large legislative body that can set an example both for other states and potentially for Congress as well. There are certain states where I think there there's maybe a better fit for a particular type of proportional representation. Um, I think this concept of voting for a party as opposed to a candidate, which we saw on sort of one side of the ballot in Germany, can feel more familiar to people in a state with straight ticket voting, where you say at the top of the ticket, just I want to vote for all the Republicans on this ticket, or I want to vote for all the Democrats on this ticket. And so that existing concept of voting for a party is, I think, something that can filter well into a proportional representation system, whether it's a system like Germany or a system like South Africa, where people will be asked to vote for a particular party as part of their ballot. Um, I think another thing that makes a legislature a particularly good fit is it's sort of a state legislature. Is it sort of large enough to potentially allow for the emergence of uh, sub parties within the major parties that exist right now. So in sort of a 100-member legislature, you might not just see 55 Democrats versus 45 Republicans. You might see minor parties emerge if they meet the threshold that George was talking about, whatever that threshold is. So you could have sort of, say, a center-right party emerge. You could have, a MAGA party emerge. And so the Republican Party might not be one party, it might be two parties or even three parties in a state legislature. And having that size of a state legislature creates that opportunity for additional parties to emerge from within the two major parties.
One thing, Neal, I would say, and I think that some people, when you raise proportional representation, they feel like you mean that we have to have 10 or 15 parties, or we need to be like the kind of pre-Nazi time and we need to splinter here. Kind of regardless of where you are with regard to parties, if you're in a two-party system or multi-party system, whatever, there are arguably some benefits for proportional representation. Like even in a two-party system, like right now, let's say in North Carolina, that's about 50-50, 50 Democratic, 50% Republican. I know there's some independents in there, but I'm simplifying it here. Their legislature is overwhelmingly Republican just because of the way the districts are drawn. Whereas if you had a mixed member proportional, or if you had some other form of proportional representation, the state legislature would be similar to the voters here, right? So there's that issue. There's also this turnout issue that you mentioned. And as we know, Bernard Fraga has a book on the turnout gap in terms of racial turnout gap. And he says that the reason there are racial disparities in terms of turnout isn't because of the sociological, this rather socioeconomic disparities. His take is it's about, is there a benefit to you voting? And if the districts are drawn in a way where you know the outcome and there's no real reason for you to vote, then your turnout's going to be lower in terms of your community, he would say here. And so, as you mentioned with the German election before, no matter where you live, your vote matters here under a proportional system. And so the point is, I think there's some, even if you're talking about a two-party system, there are some benefits. You don't necessarily have to have, 6 or 10 parties in order to have benefits. The argument for PR could benefit our existing system. The argument will go just even in terms of turnout and basic representation.
That's totally, yeah, I totally agree. I think gerrymandering is far less important in a system like Germany's. The German system enables everybody to live in a district and to have sort of some semblance of geographic representation in the Bundestag, but the lines and how they're drawn are not sort of this high stakes political battle to sort of draw districts that result in certain safe districts for a particular party, because all the parties know that at the end of the day, the share of seats in the legislature is going to be determined by proportional vote share, not how the lines are drawn for the districts themselves.
So I'll just open it up. If anybody wants to raise their hand, I've got some other questions I'll lift up, but certainly just raise your hand if you have a question. Neal and George, I do want to get into, and this is C3 nonpartisan conversation, but multiracial democracy is important, and certainly those folks who are against it, it's important to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about the alternative for Germany, AFD here a little bit here. Kind of the snap. I think my initial impression is, I was really amazed. I knew about kind of ethno-nationalist parties that were kind of against immigrants here and skeptical of outsiders. I knew about that, but I think going there and experiencing that in Germany with regard to the alternative for Germany was interesting to me. And so maybe maybe you all can tell me about your all's impressions in terms of AFD and any kind of connection to here, what's happening around the world, and just any thoughts you all might have in terms of AFD.
Yeah, I'll start. AFD is a very quintessential anti-immigrant political party, which is, I don't know if the word is ironic. Uh, One of the party leaders is a lesbian who has a Sri Lankan wife and two kids who happen to live in Switzerland. There are, I don't know, it's contradictions, but folks who supported the alternative for Germany are really doing it as a protest vote because they're so vociferously anti-immigrant. And the support for the AFD coincides very much on geographic lines. The vast majority of their kind of wins came in the former East Germany. We think about Germany as like one unified country, but for a long time they were divided between East and West, and the types of investments that were made in the West are just kind of are tremendous compared to the lack of economic investment in the East. And so the remnants of that inequality play out in really difficult ways. And so as the German economy goes through difficult times, it's really easy to use a scapegoat and talk about it's the reason why we're having such challenges is we took in too many refugees and too many immigrants, and it's changing Germany. We need Germany for Germans. And so I think what's interesting is that there was a lot of hand wringing in terms of the center right party, the CDU, was looking like they were going to win. The big question was, would they actually consider a governing coalition with the far right and the AFD? And so there was a moment at which people started to freak out because I think in terms of how legislation works, how parties move their legislation forward, they usually rely on their coalition partners in order to get enough votes. But there was one moment at which the center-right party, the CDU, said, okay, we're going to move on some fairly aggressive anti-immigrant policies, and we're open to any party supporting us, which basically was a nod to AFD, come on board, support this legislation, we can get this bill passed, and they did support it. And so that was a big taboo that was broken in terms of relying on votes of an extremist party to get legislation passed. And so as the election happened, all eyes were on the CDU of, are they going to go the next step and offer an opportunity for the AFD to form a two-party coalition? And going back to that moment of that night of the election, where the party leaders were at a round table discussing like who's going to form what coalition to govern, Friedrich Merz, the head of the CDU, basically said, we will not form a coalition with the AFD. And I think probably if you listen closely enough, the whole country largely, except for maybe East Germany, sighed a relief like, oh, okay, whew, we have escaped this kind of slippery slope into authoritarianism, and the system that allows for multiple parties and this remembrance culture that connects the AFD to that really dark history of the Nazi era allowed for the further marginalization of the AFD. Even though they got 20% of the vote, they are not in government.
Let me ask you this, Neal. I'm going to ask you to respond as well, and then I'm going to wrap us up. In addition to responding to this with regard to, the AFD and kind of that movement and its connection to movements around the world, any additional thoughts you might have in terms of remembrance culture as well? That really kind of struck me about how remembrance was really central to German identity, where as Americans, we often suppress the past and culture and history, and arguably that's happening in an affirmative way right now in terms of current policy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The split that George talked about between East Germany and West Germany, where the AFD is strongest is East Germany. And that's a place where, a lot of our guides were explaining remembrance culture was kind of weakest because for 45 years, they were under, East German control, Soviet control. And so sort of that lost 45 years of remembrance culture, I think, is playing out in large ways in, how West Germany and East Germany have very different politics when it comes to sort of, willingness to embrace authoritarianism, willing to embrace sort of anti-immigrant, rhetoric. Um, and the way sort of East Germans kind of viewed themselves as like double victims was something that really struck with me. East Germans didn't have to grapple with the fact that, sort of we were, at least facilitators or sort of standers by in a Nazi regime in the way West Germans did post 1945. So they actually viewed themselves as the victims of the Nazis. And then after 1990, they viewed themselves as the victims of the Soviet Union and the East German regime. And so sort of that grappling with the past is not occurring in the same way because it's this feeling of sort of we were the victims of history, not sort of the perpetrators.
Well, as I wrap us up, certainly want to thank you all for joining us. Thanks to George and Neal for sharing their insight and experience with us today. Incredibly important trip in terms of parallels and systems, and we just learned so much. So, George, thank you again for your leadership in terms of making it happen. Thanks also to our executive director, Lisa Bornstein, for her leadership in organizing this event and this series, and also to Joseph Ricard for organizing all the details. We look forward to seeing many of you next month on Friday, May 16th, as we talk about AAPI turnout in voting preferences in the 2024 election. Thanks so much.